Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for attending this Focali SIANI event on the impact of carbon offsetting on landscapes and the implications it will have for climate and land use policies. I'm very happy that you're here today. My name is Fedra and I work here for SEI. And one of the reasons why you're here is because we have been hosting the SIANI network for the past 10 years here at SEI. And we have a bunch of great colleagues who are unfortunately all traveling at the moment, who could not be here to welcome you today. However, I would like to share with you a couple of events. So in the last year, we have been hosting the SIANI network for the past 10 years already. And so we had some events that are of particular interest for today. We had, for example, a Global Landscapes Forum that we organized in 2017. We participated in the Committee on World Food Security, UNCFS at the FAO. We had an event with Karolinska Institute and the County Administration Board of Stockholm on planetary health. And we also had an event on forest and livelihoods, assessment, research and engagement, and the third annual meeting. As part of our SIANI network, we're also really happy to have strengthened our ties with the Gothenburg Center for Sustainable Development and the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. Today, it's World Environment Day, so we're very happy to have you here to be discussing with you this really important topic. My colleague Åsa, she's our new Global Research Director. She will provide you a little bit of background in the topic here at SEI, and then we'll hear from some speakers and be moderated. If you have any questions on SIANI or SEI, do feel free to contact any of the SEI staff. There's also some brochures in the hallway that you can see. And of course, we'll be happy to talk to you after. Thank you.
So, thank you, Fedra. And can I also extend a warm welcome to you from SEI globally. So this Stockholm Center is just one of 9 centers across the globe. We have now offices in the UK, the US, Estonia, and quickly growing centers in Asia, in Africa, and now Latin America was the latest addition. We are around 230 staff now, and SEI's mission is really to bridge science and policy, and we are really excited to see now that more and more science-based organizations, universities are coming into this space. There is a greater interest in putting research into use, we feel. But that has been our core business from the start, almost 30 years ago. And we have 3 pillars in our strategy. One is to do high quality scientific research, but also a big focus on the second pillar, policy engagement, which means both engaging before we develop our research questions to find out what is the demand, what are the needs, and also, of course, when we do the research in the process and at the end to make sure it can have the biggest impact as possible. The third pillar, which we're currently trying to build up more, where we have some work to do, and we also see greater demand, is to do capacity building. And I think the best way actually to present what research we do is to show some of our flagship initiatives. And so we have chosen to invest our core funding into 11 areas. And from the start, it was a discussion, should we have one agricultural initiative? But so far, we haven't really come to that point, but rather mainstreamed agricultural and land use issues into some of these other initiatives. So, for example, a recent addition in our portfolio is the Bioeconomy Pathways Initiative, where agriculture is very important. Also featuring in the Climate Services Initiative and some other, for example, this initiative using behavioral science to understand how agricultural innovations can be taken up in the most effective way. But when I did some research ahead of this seminar on carbon offsetting, actually we haven't done that much recently. So this topic is very complementary for us, and I hope that our SEI colleagues who will be here this afternoon can report back to us a little bit too, so we understand what are the key debates. We did some work on carbon offsetting around 10 years ago, on the clean development mechanisms and other tools under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But that work was quite critical of these mechanisms, both the additionality aspects. Are these new projects really, they have been done anyways, regardless of climate policy, and also the quality of these credits, social and environmental implications. So after that period, we have rather focused our climate policy work on trying to engage with the supply side, how to phase out fossil fuels. And now with the nationally determined contributions, the national climate plans, if you like, under the Paris Agreement, we try to provide support into how countries can transform their energy systems, energy planning. So it's a bit more direct, and we also see increased interest in sort of dealing with domestic emissions. However, as we know, and if we look through these national climate plans that have been submitted, many countries do see a need for carbon markets, carbon offsetting. There is an article in the agreement on internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, ITMOs. So this issue clearly needs more research. Also with the whole negative emission technology discussion, huge issues around land use and agriculture. So with that, I just really want to again say a warm welcome, and we really look forward to getting some reports on the findings from this seminar. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Thorsten Krause. Thank you so much for the introduction to SEI and to SIANI. I'm a researcher at Lund University and also member of the Focali Secretariat, and I'm going to be the moderator for this afternoon for the next 2.5 hours. We have invited, usually we have meetings in Gothenburg, and we decided that it's time for a change and also to come to Stockholm. So a lot of us have traveled from Gothenburg, from Lund, myself, or from Copenhagen to come here today to talk about offsetting, carbon offsetting and impacts on landscapes. And we have invited 4 speakers. One researcher from Copenhagen University, Ida Tailade, who works at the Center for Food and Resource Economics. She's going to be our first speaker. I'm going to introduce her shortly. Then we have Per Bodin, who is from research, but now works at the Swedish Board for Agriculture. And then after the coffee break, which will be in about 35 minutes, we have 2, I would say, practitioners who actually work with carbon offsetting in their business life, so to speak. I'm going to introduce Linda and Charlotta after the coffee break. So we're going to do it the following way. Each speaker has 15 minutes. Depending on whether there is time, there can be a short amount of very precise, clarifying questions after each talk. Otherwise, if there is no time, and just to keep the time that we have, I would urge you to keep your questions for the coffee break. I mean, we're a small group, so you can just approach the speakers to discuss a little bit over coffee. But there's also going to be time after the presentations for a bigger panel discussion, around about 40 minutes, so that we get out of here at 4 o'clock, hopefully with lots of new ideas and insights, but also on time to enjoy the National Day tomorrow. So that's so much for me. I'm going to introduce to you Ida Tailade. So she has worked with management and conservation of tropical forests for the past 25 years. She's currently a senior researcher at the Institute of Food and Resource Economics in Copenhagen University. Her main research interests are in the areas of indigenous knowledge and natural resource management in relation to tropical forests. She works with ethnobotanical studies on use and importance of plant resources to local people, as well as their priorities for conservation. And she has been, or is still, a consultant on conservation planning and REDD+, as well as rainforest rehabilitation. And she's also a member of the IUCN Species Survival Commission on Threatened Trees. And I know that she has worked a lot in Cambodia, and you're probably sharing that with us today. And in her presentation, she will talk about community involvement and monitoring for carbon and associated safeguards in a REDD+ project. This is the result of 5 years of research that she has conducted in Cambodia. And she will show how comprehensive forest data collected by communities can actually be really useful in calculating opportunity costs of REDD+ and also in agricultural landscapes. So some exciting results here. And the second speaker before the coffee break is Per Bodin. He has a PhD from Kalmar Högskolan. He was also at Lund University, that's where I am. He's an environmental analyst. And since 2015, he's been working at the Swedish Board for Agriculture, looking into environmental objectives as an environmental objectives coordinator and analyst. He's responsible for international and external communication in relation to agriculture and climate change, including mitigation and adaptation. Since 2017, he's also a member of the Swedish delegation for negotiations within the framework of the UNFCCC. And in his talk, he will touch upon a general overview on agriculture and how it relates to the Paris Agreement and the ongoing climate discussions or climate negotiations. And he will focus in particular on the country's nationally determined contributions and climate financing. So I hope you find these two discussions before the coffee break very stimulating. And as I mentioned, we have 50 minutes between 2:15 to 2:30 of coffee break. And then we continue with the other two presentations. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the organizing committee for giving me this opportunity to present our research on community monitoring and the role we believe it could have in implementation of REDD+. So as we all know, the most of the remaining tropical forests are inhabited by indigenous peoples or are the territories of indigenous peoples. And it is also well known that these indigenous peoples often have intricate knowledge of the environments. So I am an ethnobotanist, and as Torsten said, I'm interested in the role that local people's knowledge and institutions can play in forest management and sustainable development. The research I'll present is some of the results of the past 5 years of research, not only from Cambodia, but a range of countries. But the first question could be, why do we want communities to monitor carbon? Why can't we just do it ourselves? And by ourselves, I mean all of us educated foresters, biologists, remote sensing specialists, and so on. And I think one of the answers is, if we look to the UNFCCC texts and guidance documents, they actually do spell out explicit roles for local and indigenous peoples in the implementation of REDD. So we have some international agreements we have to adhere to. Furthermore, we know from literature that involving local stakeholders can provide a lot of other benefits. It can enhance feelings of responsibility and ownership. It can build local capacity. It can enhance decision-making at the local level, in the sense that communities who are part of the monitoring, they will faster put in new regulations and bylaws to protect the resource in a response to the monitoring results they see, while central governments usually take 5 to 10 years to do so. Local monitoring can strengthen enforcement of forest laws, as monitoring patrols enforce the laws at the same time. It can give locals a voice and improve governance. It can support indigenous people's access to rights and resources, which is one of the central debates in REDD+. So based on this, we felt there is a potential for community monitoring in REDD+ and making it a more just REDD+. It led us to formulate these 4 research questions. First, we wanted to take a look at how are REDD+ actually doing? To which extent has this local involvement been taken up by existing projects? And if it has, can communities monitor forest carbon and at what costs? Can they monitor biodiversity and at what cost? And could we possibly use the information or the data collected by local communities? In order to answer the first question, we analyzed 50 forest carbon projects, which were all validated by the CBBA, that's the Climate, Community and Biodiversity Alliance. We chose that certification scheme as it was regarded as one of the highest standards in the REDD+ market. And as you can see, by 2012, when we did this study, only about 25 projects, or 25% of the projects involved local people in monitoring carbon and livelihoods, and the percentage was a little bit higher for biodiversity. We believe this is because most of the initial REDD+ projects actually stemmed from conservation projects where local people were maybe already involved at the time of the start. So while the trend is promising, more and more projects involve local people with time, there's certainly still room for improvement in order for the projects to live up to the international promises of local involvement. So we thought maybe we could come up with some simple guidelines on how to involve communities. And in order to do so, we did comprehensive fieldwork across 8 study sites in 5 countries. These sites represent different forest types, from lowland dipterocarp forest in Borneo to lowland and hill rainforest in Cambodia, monsoonal forest in Vietnam and Laos, and mountain rainforest in Yunnan, China. So a range of forest types and different ethnic groups. Very briefly on the methods, we tried to develop very simple methods, preferably pen and paper. We then trained communities in using the same methods as the professional foresters would do according to existing REDD+ manuals. We use circular plots, and then all trees above 10 centimeters dBH, that's the diameter breast height, were measured, and from that you can calculate the forest biomass and forest carbon. In 2 of the sites, we asked both communities and the foresters to identify all the trees in the plots. And in 1 site, we furthermore trained local community members as parataxonomists. By parataxonomists, I mean members of the local community who receive a short training in botanical methods to collect specimens and prepare them. We then analyzed the accuracy and calculated the costs for both the community monitors and the professional monitors. So these 9 graphs show biomass measurement done in 289 forest plots by foresters on the x-axis and by community members on the y-axis. So if the 2 groups measure the same amount of carbon, it should be a straight line. As you can see, the first graph, there's some confusion. This is the Indonesian site, as the community monitors were uncertain how to delineate the plots, which trees to count in and which are out. But actually for the rest of the sites, the 2 groups' carbon measurements are quite similar. This led us to ask a question whether communities could improve their accuracy with more experience. So in order to test that, we went back to all the communities and foresters, and we asked them to measure all the 289 plots one more time the next year. And what this figure shows, now you don't have the statistics behind, but actually community monitors indeed did increase their accuracy the second year. More interestingly, maybe for implementation, we found that while community costs were equal to foresters' cost the first year, community cost decreased significantly the second year as they didn't need as much training. So that was the forest carbon. But how about the biodiversity? Our idea was that if these local community members were already measuring trees in this network of plots, it wouldn't be much extra effort to also identify the trees in the same plots. So this table shows a comparison between educated botanists and then community members working in their own language and how many trees they can identify. And what we found was that community members consistently could identify 95% of the tree species in the plots. When we calculated biodiversity indices, there were no significant difference between the numbers based on the botanists or the community monitors' identifications. So promising results for involving local communities. And what about the costs of community biodiversity assessments? We did some detailed breakdown of all the expenses we have had, and I'd like to draw your attention to this line. Actually, community monitors could monitor tree diversity at 1/3 of the cost of the botanical experts, who of course had to be flown in and had a lot higher salaries. Also interesting is that while the botanists spent 23% of their budget at the village level, this figure increased to almost 90% for the community monitors. So a kind of benefit which is actually dispersed at the community level. One of the benefits, hopefully, of REDD+. Now that was the field site in Yunnan, China. So we asked ourselves, was this only in China, or could we extrapolate this result to other areas and other ethnic groups? So at the moment we are working with a community in Berau in East Kalimantan. Here we have trained 6 parataxonomists, people who have no or very little formal education. And we have then asked them to work with us on tree diversity studies in the plots. And our results so far, and they've been working for 2 years on this, is that while the professional forest botanist identified 130 trees in the plots, the parataxonomist has to date collected 192 tree species. They collect specimens of very high quality. They are there all the year round, so they can collect when the trees are flowering, while the professional botanist, he will have to fly in maybe three times a year. We also found that the Dayak people group these species into a hierarchical system, and that taxa assigned to each rank are mutually exclusive. For a botanist like me, means it's easy to work with their classification system. As long as we can translate the names and understand their way of classifying, we can actually start to translate species. Finally, we looked at the costs again, and we found a result very similar to the Chinese study. Parataxonomists can collect specimens at around 1/3 of the cost of the professional botanist. Finally, I was just going to show you a figure from a recent paper published in Nature Communications, and it shows how you can use this very detailed forest data to increase the accuracy of the calculations of opportunity costs for REDD+. This is a study from Cambodia, and I think what is new is that we were able to not just calculate with biomass estimates from remote sensing, but now we could actually calculate with timber species from different classes of different diameter sizes and different species. Furthermore, we could also include some of the NTFPs that are collected by the local people and which we would otherwise not have known about. So, very brief conclusions. Yes, local communities with a little bit of training can measure forest biomass and tree diversity, as well as professionals at very comparable costs. These parataxonomists can help us improve biodiversity monitoring, and I think local generated data will also give us a wealth of other information which are useful in a more just implementation of REDD+. I think my time is about up, so thank you for listening, and thank you to all the wonderful people I have worked with.
Yes, thank you very much. And that's been actually under the time. So we have 2 minutes for short questions if there are any. Yeah, I'm going to come and give you the microphone. The microphone, by the way, is not really for us because it's a small room. It's for the audience that is listening to us.
Question on payment. To what extent were the participants from the local communities paid, and how were those levels of payment determined, if there were any?
In these sites I've worked in, we have taken a look at what's the daily rate paid if you, for example, worked in the rubber plantation or for the oil palm company. And then we have paid 50 or 100% more than that. And we've asked to work with people who are knowledgeable about forests. So it's not everyone who can do this job. And you can often see that the younger people are not as knowledgeable as the elder people. But once you start working with them, I think in some of the pictures you could see, if you prepare specimens, the whole community will come and look, what are you doing? And you start to tell the younger ones also, they see a value in their own knowledge. But it's paid better than the plantation work, which these people often dislike.
Okay, one final question over there. Just hang on.
Thank you. Did you look at the gender differences among the local people in the knowledge?
In other studies, we have looked at the gender difference. And I must say, when we asked for monitors to come and do this plot work, it's often quite strenuous because the last forests are on very steep slopes or in mountains. So all our community monitors have been men. But when we employed the parataxonomists, it quickly turned out that it was the women who would then prepare the charcoal, dry the specimens, order them in newspaper, change the paper, and so on. So it was actually the women doing half the job on that. But generally, men and women will know different tree species and have different priorities.
Okay, thank you very much, Ida. Great. Let's hear from Per.
Hi, I'm Per Bodin. I'm with the Swedish Board of Agriculture, and I realized now that I should have maybe put on the slide what the Swedish Board of Agriculture is. It's an advisory board which is underneath the Ministry for Enterprise and Innovation. So we work on a lot of different things. Many of them are connected to the Common Agricultural Policy, the EU CAP. We have failed to pay money to farmers and things like that. No, but we've had some problems, which you might have heard of in the press. I'm working at a unit called the Environment Analysis Unit. And so we are working with the environmental objectives of Sweden. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but climate change is one of the objectives. And we also work with water management in this unit. So we are sort of experts and working to assist in different inquiries and things like that. This talk is mainly going to be based on my role as a member of the Swedish delegation. So it's going to be focused on climate negotiations and how it links to agriculture. And so would be my outline. I will start with a short introduction to the Paris Agreement and nationally determined contributions and how it links to agriculture, and also a little bit about the EU NDC and the 2030 climate and energy framework, how that connects, and how an agriculture in the climate negotiations in general, and more specifically related to finance and technology transfer. So as you see, it's going to be quite an overview. It's not going to go into much detail on any of these issues. So the Paris Agreement, I'm sure you all know, or maybe most of you know, was adopted in 2015, and it was entered into effect in 2016. And here is a map of the countries who have signed and the countries who have joined and the countries who have pulled out. And as of today, this 195 parties have signed and 176 parties have joined. I don't know if US is where US is in these figures. Yeah, and the aim of the Paris Agreement is to hold global temperatures well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And so the difference between the Paris Agreement to the Kyoto Protocol, which you probably know, is that it takes a more bottom-up approach, and the bottom-up approach is then formalized in these nationally determined contributions. And so what is a nationally determined contribution? It's a non-binding national commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And it should be updated every 5 years with increased ambitions. And on a biennial basis, parties should submit national inventory reports of anthropogenic emissions and removals, and it should also provide information necessary to track progress made in implementing and achieving their NDCs. And parties are also encouraged to provide information on climate change impacts and adaptation products. And as we heard in the introduction, there is some flexibility in the Paris Agreement with the so-called internationally transferable mitigation outcomes. And it's not really decided or clear yet how these will work. This is under negotiation. And the NDCs also relate to what is called the global stocktake. And the global stocktake is a part of the Paris Agreement, and the aim of the global stocktake is to assess the collective progress towards achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. So, and then the global stocktake will then consider the outputs from the NDCs in this evaluation. How does agriculture link to the NDCs? The FAO has made 2 studies, one on the INDCs, which was the precursor of the NDCs, and one on the NDCs. But this one is the most comprehensive. So they have listed here how many countries included agriculture in their NDCs, and it's about 89% that mention agriculture or LULUCF, which is land use change and forestry. So it's quite a lot, and most of the developing countries do this in relation to adaptation. So it's about more than 90% of developing countries refer to the agricultural sector in relation to adaptation, and more than 85% of developing countries mention agriculture and or LULUCF in relation to mitigation. And many countries also identify the potential for adaptation mitigation co-benefits in their NDCs, and about 1/3 of the NDCs include afforestation and reforestation measures, or forest management, or measures for reducing deforestation, or REDD+. So there is a link to REDD+ here. It's well hidden in my presentation, so you can try to spot it. So that's the overview of agriculture in the NDCs. I was going to also mention the EU NDC, and the EU has an NDC which says that we are going to reduce our emissions by 40%, the total emissions. And so this is then linked to the 2030 climate and energy framework. And this is basically the 2030 climate framework. So for land use in this framework, the EU has decided on a no debit rule, which means that each member state ensures that accounted emissions from land use are entirely compensated by an equivalent removal of CO2 from the atmosphere through action in the sector. So there should be a net zero emissions from LULUCF in relation to a reference level, that is. And this LULUCF regulation also ensures that it's a standardized system of accounting rules, and it establishes a new governance process of monitoring how member states calculate their emissions, and also broadens the scope of accounting to cover all managed land within the EU. So, but this is my only slide in Swedish. I apologize. So this is a slightly Swedish bias. This is the 40% here is the Swedish target within the EU. The 30% reduction for the entire EU. So this is the emission effort sharing regulation, and this is the emission trading scheme, and this is the LULUCF. So the emission trading scheme, this is the big industries, the energy production, coal power plants, etc. And this is the rest of the industrial sector, including agriculture, for example, also transport. And then you have the LULUCF. So, and there is some flexibility in this. You can transfer between the sectors. So if you fail to reach one target, you can transfer your emissions within this system. And you can also trade between member states. And you can also save the surplus within the LULUCF sector to the next commitment period. So if you have a surplus, there is some flexibility in here. So this is how this one then couples to the EU NDC. So, and then you have Sweden, which is in the EU, who has its own targets that then will link to this system. So it's pretty complex. And I will not go into the Swedish goals here. So if you then take agriculture within the climate negotiations, there has been an agenda item under something that is called the SBSTA, subsidiary body for the technology and advice, yeah. And it has been ongoing since 2011, and there has basically been no outcome until last autumn, when there was a sudden breakthrough caused by, or at least partly caused by, a change in the head of delegation, the negotiator for the G77 in China, which was Egypt before, and then went to Uruguay. And so in this autumn there was a decision that was then later named that there's going to be a joint program between the SBI, which is the subsidiary body for implementation, and the SBSTA, to work jointly on agriculture. And it got a name, and since last meeting was in Fiji, well, it was in Bonn, but it was in Fiji, it got a name from a hill in Fiji called Cornivia. So this was the breakthrough, and the decision was that it was going to be a series of workshops, and Now in May, it was a decision on how these workshops, when they were going to be taking place, and also how they're going to be reported back in different reports and report backs to the COP in 2020. So that was the success story. Other negotiations that relate to agriculture are connected to what is called the Paris Rule Book, which is how the Paris Agreement is going to be implemented, and this is an ongoing negotiations, and it should be finished at the COP in Katowice, and it's not going very well, so therefore they're having an extra meeting in Bangkok in September to try to speed things up a bit. So the agenda items that relate to agriculture or land use change are the one about cooperative approaches, which is about these ITMOs, among other things, and it's also about the further guidance in relation to the mitigation in NDCs, the transparency framework, and global stocktake. And the two agenda items related to further guidance and transparency framework, they have now ended up in very large documents containing everyone's views, and they are trying now to, from these huge documents, get down to a decision text, which takes time. So that's why we're having this extra meeting. So, and these long texts, they contain some information on agriculture, REDD+, and LULUCF. So it's not quite clear how these concepts are going to fit into the Paris Rule Book, but there are elements within the negotiations that relate to those issues. So that's why we need to monitor these negotiations. And so key issues related to these negotiations are how you're going to treat natural disturbance. Is that just a forestry? Oh, 1 minute. So you can read them. And so this is just a list of the different technology mechanisms for how transferring technology from developed to developing countries, and a list of financing mechanisms under the UNFCCC. So I will just end with this one, which is about the Green Climate Fund, which is the key delivery mechanism of climate financing, and it has a target of $100 billion, and it's totally 76 projects, and the aim is to deliver equal amounts to mitigation as well as adaptation. And developing country parties can now access support for activities across the 3 REDD+ phases, and since October 2017, the board has approved a pilot program for REDD+ result-based payments. So it's in the startup phase. So thank you for listening. Here's the Coronivia negotiation team. Sorry for... So there's no time for questions.
We could take just one question if there's an urgent question. Otherwise, we can probably, if you have a question for clarification, you can ask Per over coffee. Unless someone wants to ask a very urgent question that's burning, then I would say that we proceed to the coffee, which is going to be outside, I suppose. Linda, Maria? Yeah. So there's coffee. I think there's coffee outside, and there's also a little fika outside. And I would really appreciate if you could be back here in about, I think it's 20 minutes. In 20 minutes. Thank you. Okay, I have the pleasure to introduce our two speakers from the private sector. After we heard some more insights into research that's been going on, looking at monitoring and indigenous or communities involving in monitoring, but also the complexity of international climate negotiations and the different nationally determined contributions. We're going to have Linda Andersson, who's going to be the first presenter now. Linda has been working and living at the Viskogen regional office in Nairobi for the last 3 years. But now she has moved back to Stockholm. Yeah. And is the policy officer for agroforestry and sustainable agriculture here at the head office in Sweden. She also coordinates the Agroforestry Network, which is a platform for international agroforestry practice based in Sweden that promotes the use of agroforestry in developing countries. And Linda has a background in both private sector and civil society with a special interest in corporate sustainability and carbon offsetting. That's why she's here today. She will talk about the work that they're doing in Viskogen, or Viskogen.
Yeah, Viskogen.
Viskogen, yeah. And how sustainable agriculture and agroforestry can be a part of mitigation priorities in the NDCs. And she's going to present more in-depth results or in-depth finding from a case study story in Kenya, the Kenya Agricultural Carbon Project. After Linda, we have Charlotta Szczepanowski, who is the head of sustainable development at Riksbyggen, a big construction company or housing company.
We develop property.
Property developing
and managing.
All right. In Sweden, where she's been working for almost 10 years, the last 10 years, and she's a chairman on the board of the Swedish Association for Sustainable Businesses. And before, she has been working with environmental issues at the Swedish Post and Electrolux company. And she will talk about how the work at Riksbyggen is, how they're working with climate offsetting, and how organizations within the Swedish Association for Sustainable Business are looking upon climate offsetting or carbon offsetting in particular. So we're very much looking forward to those two presentations, and then give the floor to Linda right now.
Thank
you.
Very nice to be here, and super interesting to hear the findings also from the studies before. Yes, I work for Viskogen. It's Viego Forestry in our region. And my question today is if carbon offsetting can fight both poverty and climate change. And I can't push it down.
Okej, du får trycka där istället.
This one instead. Okay, fair enough. Okay, then up. No, up.
Spännande.
No. Yeah, no, it works. Super. Yes. And I would like to bring us back to who we think this is all about. And for Viskogen or Viego Forestry, it's all about Margaret Muchanga, who is one of the women in Kenya that we work with in carbon offsetting. And why I bring her up is that because this is who we are working with, and this is why we do carbon offsetting. For us, it's about fighting exactly both poverty and climate change together. So the full reason why Viego Forestry is even doing carbon offsetting programs is because of the adaptation effects, the productivity increase. And the mitigation itself is a bonus. The carbon credit itself is just a bonus. It's the other thing that really matters. Some of you might already know what Viskogen does, but more or less we have been around since 1983, and our core business is of course to plant trees. But since then our mission has developed. Today we have a strong presence in East Africa. We work in 4 countries, and we have connected our work to primarily 5 of the SDGs. So no hunger, no poverty, gender equality, climate change, and life on land. And we do this together with smallholder farmers and their farm organizations. Today we work with approximately 54 farm organizations. And since the very beginning in 1983, we together with these partner organizations have planted approximately 123 million trees and supported 2.5 million people. So why then the carbon offsetting programs from this? Well, we have 17 projects running at the moment, and 4 of them are carbon offsetting ones, because we saw that there is a need for truly linking the private sector with the civil society organizations, and we saw a way to finance development through these carbon offsetting programs. And I'm really happy to see that you mentioned how strong the agricultural is in the NDCs, for example. And I'm a huge fan of maps, and I found this map from CCAFs. I know it's a year old, it's from 2017, and it's from the INDCs, and I haven't found a new one for the NDCs. But I still think it's quite fascinating that, one, someone did look through all the NDCs to see how strong agroforestry really is in them. But then 2, also see that there is quite a number of countries that actually are prioritizing agroforestry specifically in the NDCs, 23 more or less. I would like to see the whole map filled, definitely. But it's a good start, more or less. So, what type of projects are we doing then when it comes to carbon offsetting? I won't go through all of them, but we have 4 carbon offsetting programs with a different setup, all of them. And I will focus today on the Kenya Agricultural Carbon Project, which is one of the first ones. So our approach is that we work together with smallholder farmers in farmer groups or in farm organizations, and we have one partner, either a donor, investor, or some kind of on-the-ground partner. And the CO2 sequestrations comes, as in the Plan Vivo project or Tree Sustain Life, solely from trees, or it comes from a combination, which is the projects that we're developing at the moment, which is carbon offsetting from trees and also sustainable agricultural land management, so SALM from the soil. So these are the 4 we have, and the one I'm focusing today on is the Kenya Agricultural Carbon Project. So this is a project that we jointly developed together with the Biocarbon Fund at the World Bank and Unique Land Forestry. And it's funded from the beginning by both the Biocarbon Fund but also by SIDA to some extent. And today we're implementing this project together with almost 30,000 farmers in Kenya. They are smallholder farmers, 0.5 to 2.5 hectares. And from the beginning, they're all on subsistence agriculture, basically. These 30,000 farmers are organized into self-help groups, 20 to 30 farmers each, so in 1,700 groups. And as per today, almost 22,000 hectares are under SALM. So it's a significant area. We use SALM we see it as a holistic approach to both get the social benefits, the economic benefits, and the environmental benefits. Because as I remembered before when we talked about Margaret Muchanga, that is the whole purpose of it. It's not about actually mitigating. It's about restoring agricultural production, increasing the farm productivity, and diversifying the food sources to get the adaptation effect and increase resilience. And then we also contribute to the GHG emission reduction. And I just got some fresh figures from our excellent M&E officer in Nairobi, Peter Washira, and we're at the 3rd verification of the CAS project. And so far on 22,000 hectares, the project and the farmers per se have sequestered 329,000 tons of CO2 emissions, or equivalents, which gives us about 2.14 tons of CO2 per hectare. This is with all the buffers and everything removed. So when the farmers calculate how much CO2 is sequestered in the soil and the trees, we then remove a buffer and buffer again, and that's the figure we get. Yes. So, what is then these practices that we are promoting? Well, the whole reason why we started working in the areas of Kenya is because of the degraded land, of course, and also a quite severe number of unsustainable practices, such as burning of residues or quite heavy tillage or using raw manure. And the result is a quite heavy land degradation and also low crop yields. And what we are then promoting is the sustainable agricultural land management, and we even have our own little Bible for it, the SALM handbook. And it's both for the adaptation and mitigation benefits. So, what are then the practices? Well, the practices are a huge set of practices from the SALM, but then there are only a few that we actually calculate the carbon from. So for example, when it comes to soil organic carbon, the farmers implement residue use from short-term trees, for example, compost from raw manure and residue, mulching and cover crops. And for the above ground biomass in trees, it's of course a mix of improved varieties of agroforestry trees. And these together then combines into a carbon model. And this is what is measured as well. So where would we like to see Margaret Muchanga's farm to be within the project period? Well, in the best of worlds, like this. And quite a number of them that I visited actually look like this. So you start at the very top before the SALM is implemented. It's a quite heavily degraded farm with the free flow of water and so on, which goes then to year number 1, where you can see the farm is being divided into sections. You start a bit of a crop variety, a few trees being planted along the way. We'll take you to the next year, more trees, more diversification, and then after 8 years, hopefully this. And this is along the way we see the 2.14 tons of carbon sequestered. And looking at the SALM practices that we promote, as I said, we promote a huge handful, maybe 20 of them altogether, but there is only a few that we actually measure for the carbon. So I would dare to say that the carbon sequestration is most likely higher than what we measure, but to get that extra buffered off, we only measure from these ones. So when we do a carbon sequestration project, if I can call it that, we want to see 3 main benefits. We want to see the social, the environmental, and the economic ones. And looking at the environmental changes, we follow the farms on GPS every year. And of course, the community monitoring is a huge part of that. So the farmers monitoring themselves. But just to give you a view of how the landscape changes in 2009 to 2017. And we'll take you down to Kenya and one of the farms there. This is in 2002. One of the farmers in the project, 10, 11, 14, and 17. So you can see there's a quite huge improvement of trees planted, but also the way the farms are divided. Then, of course, also brand new figures for today, super happy. We measure, of course, how much yields do the farmers actually get. And to be true, it's not us measuring it. It's the farmers themselves measuring on a seasonal basis how much they harvest. And we measure, among other things, maize, bean, and sorghum. And since 2009, we actually see a 250% increase in maize. And when I presented these figures in 2015, we were at 90%. So it keeps increasing. And you can see it's not as vast increase in beans and sorghum, but it's still there. And I looked up the figures for average maize production in Kenya, looking at the FAO figures from 2010 to 2016 and taking an average of that. And an average Kenyan farmer would produce approximately 1,600 kgs of maize per hectare. And a cusp farmer would do 3,200. So the benefit is not in the mitigation, the benefit is in the yield production and the increase of food on the table from that, and also on income, of course. Speaking of income, we did a research in 2015 together with eCRAF. These are part of the figures showing how much farmers actually save who are in the project. And what we can say clearly is that farmers within the CAST project, all of them save in some way. And more farmers than the control groups saves $1 to $2 per day. So we see an absolute increase. There's definitely more to be done on this, but it's a good indication that it has both economic, social, and environmental impacts. And quickly going back to those actual environmental impacts. Since we measure both tillage, we measure both the good and the bad practices, so to say. So we measure what is increasing when it comes to the good practices and what is decreasing in the practices that is actually not giving so much back to the farmer. We can see a huge improvement. Just giving 2 examples. If you look at 2009 and the burning of residues, almost 60% of the farmers were burning residues at the time, which is now down to almost 0. And instead, what has increased? The mulching and the cover crops and the reduced tillage. So we see it's a push from both ways, which is super interesting. I'm just going to touch briefly on the monitoring because I thought it was so interesting that you said back to community monitoring, and it's absolutely possible. So we use a SMS-based or text message-based system for monitoring. So every season farmers send in basically farm records on how much have you harvested, how much have you planted, what have you done, and those are then put into our M&E system and calculated towards the emission reductions. So it's farmers doing this themselves. It has proven to be quite a cost-effective way of doing things, but also accurate. And I think one of the most important things is that as a farmer, if you report your own achievements, you also get a sense of a higher sense of knowledge on what you actually are doing in terms of climate compensation, but also adaptation on climate change. But I think also important is what we discussed in the break, that if you know how much your farm produces, and if you know what exercises to do to increase your productivity, you have your farm record, basically. And if you have your farm record, you also have a business mindset of your farm and start going from subsistence farming to a profit-giving farming. So it's a multiple use. We've been doing these types of projects since 2009, and we have learned our lesson, good and bad. And I just put together a few do's and don'ts in Viskoggen's approach that we would like to highlight. And one of them is the upfront investment. We need upfront investments to do carbon offsetting programs and for them to be sustainable. You can't have investors paying afterwards. We need them upfront. Local expertise, definitely a lead organization on the ground together with local farmer organizations. And also strengthening institutional capacity. And that is strengthening the farmer organizations that are eventually going to take over the product per se and keep monitoring and keep developing and keep spreading. And I think I cannot mention enough the market incentives. It's being clear from the beginning that it's not about the mitigation income, because that is a tiny, tiny part. The absolute best benefits for the local community is the productivity increase and the adaptation benefits. The mitigation is still a bonus. And of course, monitoring, having activity-based monitoring with the farmers, with the community per se, and sustainability. We would not do a carbon offsetting program if it didn't have those three parameters. So we learned our lesson, and from CASP we then developed our Livelihoods Mont Elgon project together with a French investment firm. That's where you have the upfront financing, and together with a local market, a value chain, somewhere to sell your products, together with Brookside Dairy. So we developed a project that is aiming to increase the livelihoods for 30,000 farmers, more or less the same size as CASP, but this time we've learned our lesson. We have the upfront financing. We also have a clear value chain attached to it. We have a much stronger collaboration with local farmer organizations. This is developed together with 15 dairy cooperatives in Kenya. And we also have a stronger component on not only trees and agriculture, but also the watershed. And the ambition is, we started this in 2015, and it will run for 10 years, and we have a 3.5 million euro investment. The ambition is to reach a 30% crop increase at least, and increased milk revenues, going from 5,000 litres to 135,000 litres in the project, and sequester 1 million tons of CO2 in both trees, soil, and dairy productivity. So we started with 1 in 2009, now we have 4, and so far we are super happy.
Thank you, Linda. All the speakers are very easy to manage because they're all under the time budget that we have. So there's 2 minutes for clarification questions for Linda. Anyone? Susanne?
Thank you very much. That was very impressive. The production increase is very, very high. I'm wondering, do you have any idea, or do you look into what if there is an increase in production per worked hour In that case, can you say something about that?
I really wish I could. And it's interesting because two of the things that are very little researched on when it comes to agroforestry and sustainable agriculture and land management is the socioeconomic aspects. We don't look into it, we don't measure it ourselves, but I would really like to see it. So if someone is in the research is eager to do so, I thought it would be super interesting. When you look at the agroforestry research per se, doing reviews of what is done on agroforestry, the socioeconomics are really low. So I would really like to see it.
If no one has a question, I
have a question about the yields as well. There was an increase in the yields. Have you looked at the stability of the yields as well? Has that changed? And have you tried to quantify it, or is it or qualitatively assess it?
I can't answer the question actually. I need to speak to our M&E guru in Nairobi for that one. But I would say, if I'm not mistaken, that you can see a fluctuation that goes also with the fluctuations in Kenya per se. I know there's a dip around 2015, if I'm not mistaken, which goes quite well with, I would believe, the drought that year. But I'm not quite sure. It's still a less of a dip than you would otherwise. Yeah.
Maybe I just take the liberty of asking a question myself.
Bring it on.
It was very impressive. And I was thinking that to what extent do you actually also work with some technological advances? So not just planting trees and trying to get better agricultural practice, but also actually decreasing, for example, the amount of wood needed to cook, and like efficient stoves, smokeless kitchens and so on, that could complement actually the carbon benefits and also health and so on.
I didn't mention it because I think it's somewhere it just goes for us without thinking about it. But yes, so I would say in most of the projects that we do, we have an energy efficient component, either if it's from biogas, which is not huge, but it's there. It's a bit of a heavy investment, but at least on energy efficient cook stoves. So either if it's just energy efficient with less firewood, or if it's with briquettes. If you look at, for example, the carbon offsetting program in Uganda, we're looking at briquettes together with energy efficient stoves. It's a two-way combination of that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. All right, then. Okay, one short question while Charlotte is setting up.
You put a figure of 2.14 tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare. Is that per year? Just to compare to what we know from forests. Yes. Oh,
it's per year.
That's impressive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And that figure is for per year as per year 7. So we've done it for 7 years, and then we'll see if it decreases or increases.
Hello, Charlotta Szczepanowski. I work as Head of Sustainable Development at Riksbyggen, and I will talk about how we work with climate offsetting and what we compensate for, and what the driving forces are, and also about why we choose to work with Viskogen, if that's not obvious after this fine presentation, Linda. And then I will finalize with some lessons learned. And then after that, I'll just switch to having another hat on my head and being the chairman of the Swedish Association for Sustainable Development, and show you a small study where we asked some companies within that association how they think about carbon offsetting. But before I start, just quick about Riksbyggen. We are a company that develop housing property, and then we manage housing properties, both our own and also housing association, bostadsrättsföreningar. Around 500,000 people live in apartments that we are managing. So we're quite big, 5,000 apartments in production at present. And someone asked me here if I called it compensation or offsetting. We speak Swedish all day long in Riksbyggen, so my English might not be perfect, but I'm not afraid of speaking English, but it won't be perfect. we compensate for our emission arising from air, from the flights that our employees are doing. And the reason for us to compensate is that we want a driving force for our employees to change their behavior. So by making the transportations more expensive by air, then we think that they should choose train instead. So they should choose another mode of transportation. So we try and find incentives internally to change behavior. And as an extra value, we saw that when the Swedish government initiated the initiative of climate change challenge, the klimatväxlingsutmaningen, we saw that the compensation, the climate offsetting could be one part of this program, so that we can adapt to this program by doing this. So this is like an extra value. And this is an initiative that is under the Fossilfritt Sverige in Sweden. But as you can see, we are compensated for 620 tons. And as you can see in the picture, we emit a lot of more carbon dioxide. And this is only for our internal work. I mean, we're emitting a lot more when the houses are being built. So this is just a very, very small part of it. So you have something to sell to me, maybe try and get me convinced that I should offset the other carbon dioxide as well. But the reason for us not doing that is that I think, and that's how I've talked about it within my company, that we should really use those money to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions instead. And we are working hard on our own properties to renovate them and make them reducing their carbon dioxide, and also with our cars, for example, that we own, so that they should be a better fleet of vehicles and reducing our carbon dioxide by using electric cars, for example. So we choose to work with our own emissions instead. And we reduced our carbon dioxide with approximately 35% over the last year. So this is really something that we're doing quite hard. And I also want to say that we're working with programs with WeEffect, for example, and our core business is housing association. So we work with housing association with WeEffect. So we work with different, just for sponsoring or just for helping other cooperatives, that we do that in other ways. So this is not the only thing that we're doing. And we choose to work with Viskogen. And the reason is that we are a cooperative company, and cooperative companies has like in their core to try and help other cooperatives in other countries. So that's why we thought that Viskogen was such a good partner from the start. And we also think that Viskogen is very credible, since they work with the standards. We want it to be like Plano Vivo or something like that. And when Viskogen came and presented their idea that we should compensate with them or climate offsetting with them, then I was afraid about the monocultural, that we should plant trees in rows. So then when they talked about the agroforestry, that was when I decided that, okay, let's go for climate offsetting with Viskogen. So without the agroforestry, we wouldn't be here today. So some lessons that we learned, that both the method and the company need to be credible for us. Because before we worked with Tricorona as a partner, and then they had a business on the side that helped the companies to reduce their climate emissions. And then I thought that that was a credible company. And then they choose to not work with that anymore. So they only were working with the climate compensation. And then I thought they're not credible anymore. And then Viskogen called, and then we got to work with them instead. So what is really both the method, because the method that Tricorona works with is credible, I think. But this was the match. We needed both the company and the method. And it is good if the work around the company compensation is very simple. Now I think it's a bit more complex with Viskogen than it was with Tricorona. Everything worked out very well and very smooth. But now every year there is something. Where should we put the money? It's something here, but we think that it's better that there is a credible company than it is simple. So it's more important for us to work with a credible company than that everything is simple, but we could improve here. the cooperation. And then, sadly enough, the compensation that we're working with doesn't lead to decrease travel by flight because the carbon dioxide is too cheap. So you don't see that effect. And then you could think maybe why don't we stop working with this type of climate offsetting? But I think that would send the wrong signal. And also I hope in the future that the true cost of carbon dioxide would really be there. And then I think that would have an effect. So I'm really waiting for the true cost of carbon dioxide. So we're continuing. And now for my other part of the presentation, I am the chairman of the Swedish Association of Sustainable Business. It's a nationwide association, and we are cross-industry, and we are around 217 members, and it's the large companies in Sweden, you could say. And I sent out a small survey within the board. And they were these companies answering the questions. They're quite large companies here in Sweden. And when I asked them, what do you think about companies using climate assets? No one, more than myself, but I didn't answer this, thought that it could be a tool for companies to reduce their carbon dioxide emissions. Many thought that it was a way for companies to compensate for climate gases they need to emit. And only a few companies said it's greenwash. So I think we still need to be very careful on how we communicate when we work with climate offset, because there are still people thinking that it might be greenwash. So about the communication, I think it's important. And I also think that there might be something here for you who work with climate offsetting to find new business solutions so that we can drive new habits internally, and by that reducing both the carbon dioxide that we emit and creating those good things that Linda just talked about. And when I asked what kind of climate offsetting do you think is most credible, it really doesn't matter. This to me is saying that it doesn't matter because everything has almost the same. And so as long as it is standardized, we really don't know when you're talking about the different standards within the companies, we don't have very much knowledge about that. We need to lean upon that if it's a standard, it's a good one. If we're not, I mean, we can go in, but I think that's how we work. We don't have the time really to go into deep. That's what this show me. And the future bright for climate offsetting. When I asked how will you use climate offsetting in the future, our company would use climate offsetting more. 75% of the companies said so. Our company will use climate offset less. And then this company doesn't compensate today and will not do it in the future either. So just to summarize, we are using climate offsetting because we want to reduce our travel by air. So this is like trying to get the driving force to change behavior within the company, but it doesn't work. We don't use offsetting for the other climate gases. We focus rather on reducing our emissions. We use Viskogen for climate compensation because we think they're credible and it's really good matching our own company. And a study in this association then shows that companies see climate offsetting as a way to compensate for emissions they cannot reduce. And we see that it doesn't matter really which method is being used as long as it's something that we can feel is credible. Like, I don't know, yeah, I can explain this more if you have any questions. I can see here there are some questions, but I think that we're not, what I want to send out here is don't expect us to be expert on these different methods. So as long as they are standardized, I think that we can't really have the time to go deeper into that. And the companies will use climate offsetting more in the future. Thank you.
Okay, so where are the questions? There was one. All right.
Yes, thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Please, for now, we ask questions. Please just introduce yourself and where you're from.
Okay, my name is Sara Brogård and I'm from Lund University, Sweden. Yeah. Thank you for the interesting presentation. I was curious because you said it didn't work so well with the travel by air. No. Do you have other measures to trying to reduce your air?
We bought a video conference system, and so we have reduced our travel by air, but we can't see that is something that is driving it. So we have new we have policies, and we have different the video conference in every office and everything. So we're really trying hard to reduce the travel by air, and I think that we are succeeding, but I can't see that anyone, when I'm talking to them, that they really think about this, even though they see it on their, when they are buying the ticket, they don't care about that anymore. Or they don't care about it.
Maybe it's the other way around.
I don't think
they
so.
see it as a reason to travel more by air, because you compensate. Just as throwing in a
I don't know. I don't think so. That's not how we are communicating it internally.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Anyone else has an urgent question?
I just want to clarify that the things we pay, we don't pay it centrally. They pay it in their own business. So that I think is very important. So that has been very important to me, that we are not the one paying it centrally. They are paying it in their own business, and that is how I thought that might be a driving force. So I want the manager of this people to say that this is going to these planes, these travels that you're doing are too expensive. Why don't you choose train? That's where I want to go. So we're not doing it on the top. We're doing it.
All right, then I think we should kindly ask the other three presenters to also come to the stage, and we can just turn around some of the chairs if you don't want to stand the whole time. We can actually take these here. And then we can open the floor for larger discussion with the help of the audience. And I'll just wait until we figure that out. Need to get the headphone out here. Okay. I just wanted to start with something. I think it's very interesting what you mentioned, that actually the offsetting itself and the carbon is not so important. It's basically a vehicle to get to the more important benefits that are adaptation and that are actually like poverty reduction or more resilient agriculture actually in that case, which I think is something that's quite telling. And I think that's something we see quite a lot also in RED+ projects, that the carbon itself is maybe not so important really. It's more like a tool to get the financing needed to pursue other benefits or to pursue other goals, which is the protection of forests or is the poverty reduction in local communities and so on and so forth. And I think also you pointed towards that in a way as well. So I think this is quite interesting, I mean, given the title of the seminar today. And that brings me to, I have two questions that I would like the panelists to answer if they want to, and then we can open the floor for questions from the audience. The first one is basically pointing towards when we talk about RED+, when we talk about carbon compensation around forestry, for example, there's been a lot of critique since the RED+ mechanism was kind of introduced or was started to be debated. A lot of critique pointing towards the loss of rights for local or indigenous community, unmet expectations. There was a lot of hype around RED+ in the beginning. A lot of money was supposed to actually reach local communities, and people were told many different things it hasn't materialized. And I worked with Red Plus as well for a long time. And if you ask people about the carbon money that was supposed to reach the communities, people were really disappointed and said like, well, we've been hearing about this for years and nothing has ever come. So maybe like some of you who have worked with this, what future do you see for these kind of mechanisms that have been debated for 10 years, 12 years at the international policy arena, but actually haven't really materialized yet? I just invite you for some short comments. You can use this microphone here.
Thank you, Torsten. During my work with Red Plus, I've had many communities saying the same. Yes, we heard now we were going to be paid to protect forests, but we're still waiting 10 years later. So I have two observations I would like to share with you. One is that when you're looking at budgets for the international Red Plus projects, or programs. I've reviewed many different UN Red roadmaps and World Bank FCPF Red Plus strategies. And what I found was that about 95% of the budgets were all to be spent in the capital city, all on meetings, workshops, coordinating committees, Red Plus agencies, Red Plus task forces, Red Plus platforms. None of the funds left the ministries. So I think that's quite telling why people still have to wait at the local level. And the other thing is, as you say, there's been a lot of discussions about local people's rights, and I would say rightly so. That's why we started to work with community monitoring, because I think we have to turn the whole Red Plus implementation upside down and start from the local level now. We have had 10 years of Red Plus readiness. Now we have to start to work with communities, hearing their wishes, and I think that will address both of these two, you could say, challenges of Red Plus. I haven't met a community that wasn't eager to conserve their forest. So I think that's not where the problem is. It's more our approach. We have to work more locally.
Yeah, I fully agree. Viskogen hasn't worked ourselves in Red Plus or Red projects, but listening to the critique that has come up, there are definitely challenges. I mean, yes, the world's forest needs to be preserved, but I guess you need to approach it in the same way as you would do in any sustainable and effective development project. You need to start with the community, and project needs to be developed from a community's approach, including all members, indigenous and non, and including both men and women. Looking at the critique on gender equality in the Red Plus and Red programs, it is understandable. Someone wrote, I can't remember who, that there is no such thing as there is no such thing as gender neutrality in forests, and I think it's very true. You need to start both with women and men, and you need to start with the communities and develop both monitoring and product implementation and product design from that level, and then it could work.
Yeah, I'm no expert on Red Plus, but from what I've heard from my colleagues in the delegation, they seems that they are quite happy with the framework. It's been well negotiated. It's been a long project process, and now it's existing. And I was at a side event at the last Substa meeting, which was from the Green Climate Fund, and they are now, as I said, looking into these pilot studies on these Red Plus result-based payments. And so from what I heard, it sounded very promising, but I have no insight in the GCF, so I was more trying to direct a question towards maybe you, Ida, who might know about the GCF, because I think they had some ideas, at least, how to try to increase the ground level involvement. That's what so that was my more of a question than a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I can add to something as well from my personal experience. I totally agree with you. I mean, it has to be in many ways locally driven, but often what we find in these negotiations that there are these grand ideas that are designed by people who have, I mean, they don't live in these forests, or they don't live with the day-to-day issues that you have to deal with. And basically, it's grand ideas that sound really great on paper, but then when it comes to the implementation locally, that's where we often stop. And I also agree with you. I mean, there's so much money going around, and often this money is desktop conservation. It's basically people sitting in capitals around the world writing reports over and over. And that's where the carbon offsetting, or that's where the money for carbon compensation goes, but actually is very rarely going to where it should go. And that's why I think I would congratulate you for your approach, because that's something that I think is actually really hands-on, and one can actually observe the changes, and you show that quite nicely as well with the satellite pictures and how it has changed and actually made a difference in people's lives. The other question I had, and then we can open the floor, so I would urge you to prepare some thoughts or some comments as well. You can also chip in on these questions, of course, is that so now we're sitting here in Stockholm, in Sweden, and I've just, in preparation for today, I looked up the ecological footprints of countries in Scandinavia, of Sweden, of Norway, and of Denmark. And if everybody would live as we do, we would need 4 planets, just because of the materials that we consume and just the way we live. At the same time, of course, one could say like, well, Denmark and Norway particularly, but also Sweden are doing great things when it comes to actually spending money on fighting poverty, mitigating climate change, doing research in many countries around reducing deforestation. And Norway has been in the news for a number of years now, spending a lot of money on actually reducing deforestation in DRC and Indonesia, but also in Guyana. But I mean, not wanting to be too critical, but I think we kind of have to. Isn't carbon offsetting or carbon compensation, whatever you want to call it, not just actually a way to distract ourselves from the real problem and the real challenge that we actually need to do? I mean, decreasing flights of employees within Sweden, and I'm Lund University, they did a study as well, and the major emissions are actually flights between Malmö and Stockholm, where you can take a train. These are small changes, but they actually lead to a bigger problem that sometimes it's easier to look somewhere else than actually like asking ourselves, what can we do about it? And I think this is a question as well for you to comment on if you would like to. Maybe you can start here.
Yeah, I think it's a good question, because I think that we need to understand, all the companies need to understand that sustainability is about the core business, and we really need to look upon these sustainable development goals as a new future, and then see how our business model is really fitting into that new future, and then lead our companies towards that future. And that's really not the way how businesses, I'd say, is really doing it. We're looking more, I think we're a bit towards that in my company, since I'm now in the top level group. But the most people, they are just working with their business model as it is, and then try to like reduce their carbon dioxide and minimize their footprint on the planet, but not changing their business model. And often they need to change their business model or their strategy or their way they are steering their companies, because they need to see the complexity as it is. So I think it's a really good question, that is really the core of these companies within the Western world, that we need to change for real.
Right.
So I think it's a good question, but this is something on the side. I see it like that.
Yeah, we believe that it's neither or. It's not, we can't just do one of them. We need to do both. And looking at where the world is going, we're going towards 10 billion people in 2050, and the land will not be more for agricultural productivity. We need to use what we have, and to be able to feed a world of 10 billion, we need to increase productivity. At the same time, we need to reduce the carbon emissions and sequester. So I think that we can't just focus on one of these things. We need to do both at the same time, and that's how complex the climate change is. And we found that carbon offsetting is one way of financing that type of development. It's no silver bullet, And the methods of agroforestry and SAL will not solve it all, but it's one way of doing it. And we found that by finding a market for these development projects, it's a way to both fight poverty and climate change at the same time. So there are both pros and cons, definitely. And one thing that you often see is that it is really discouraging when the flights are not going down. At the same time, you can see that there is a shift in companies that do offset have a tendency to also reduce their own emissions in other cases. And when you see a cost for something in red, you try to reduce it. It's not always the case, but it can happen.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I just want to be clear that we have really reduced our emissions, so and also from the flights, but it's more of a feeling that this is not that they don't think about that small extra cost when they are booking their tickets. That I'm really sure of that, and I have people within the organization, and we are asking these questions, and it doesn't really work that way. But other things works absolutely. So maybe we are encourage them to think more about the sustainability by doing this. That can be one of the driving forces as well.
Ida?
I was just going to say, when you posed the question, I came to think of that very many indigenous associations, they would say exactly what you said. It's the global market, it's capitalism who created the problem of climate change. They are not going to fix it. They are part of the problem, not part of the solution. On the other hand, I think we should remember that deforestation and forest degradation is contributing up towards 20% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. If we do not do anything about deforestation, we're not going to reach the Paris Agreement goals. And I believe that these offsets is just one of the ways we can start to work with combating forest degradation and forest clearings. So there are many problems, so we should probably use many different solutions. If you read the next IPCC report, the sixth assessment report coming out soon, I think it'll be very clear what you said. We have to work on all different fronts. There's not one solution, it's not enough.
Yeah, my comment kind of relates to that. If you want to, I mean, pragmatically, if you want to reach 1.5 degrees, we need to do both. We need, we need negative emissions to reach the 1.5 degree goal. And the same goes for the Swedish target of net zero emissions by 2045. If you're going to reach those, there is some room for emissions, but then we need to compensate by these complementing measures, and these complementing measures involve carbon offsetting in some way, either for bio-CCS or increased carbon storage in forests, or trading, which then is emission reductions in another country. And another thing I was thinking about, which is not carbon offsetting in one way, but it's this debate that is ongoing about flying or eating meat. There is this never-ending story in the press, and I'm as working at the Swedish Board of Agriculture and as a private person, I'm getting really annoyed by this debate, because you have one side saying, okay, this meat consumption needs to be reduced, and the other one saying, no, it's the flying that needs to be reduced. And then you have the meat producers, the Swedish meat producers on one side, and you have environmentalists on one side. But the thing is, you cannot choose. There's no choosing. We need to cut down our fossil fuel emissions. That's the primary. And then we also need to reduce our food consumption. I mean, we import 50% of our beef to Sweden. And even if we could reduce our consumption by half and still keep the same production level as today. So there is no either or. It's we need to do both. And so that's the whole thing. But it's a psychological, I mean, it's tricky. People cannot keep
two balls in the air at the same time. So that's a trick to, and even in the newspapers, people cannot keep two thoughts at one same time in the debate. So I think that's a trick.
Yeah, please.
I totally forgot to answer the question about if Sweden should be ashamed or not.
I didn't.
Well, I think it's really good you mentioned that we have all of these investments in carbon offsetting and smart agriculture abroad, but we also need to look at what we are emitting ourselves extremely. And there I would really like to highlight the need for both looking at our own emissions with products produced in the country, but also looking at our emissions from products produced outside. So if we are flying to whatever country we would like, we need to take those emissions for ourselves.
Yes, I mean, just as a side note to here, I mean, I live in Skåne, and
Great place, by the way.
It's a great place, but I mean, there's so much investment in agroforestry in other countries. Why can't we do it here? Like Skåne.
You do. Oh no.
I know there is, but when I take the train from Malmö to Lund, I see an agricultural desert.
Yeah, it is true.
So, and that's so sad sometimes, you know. But I think we should open the floor to the audience, so you don't get bored listening to us all the time speaking. There's one question over there. Could you? Thank you.
I can speak. I don't like this one. My name is Wilmar. Okay. Oh, sorry. My name is Wilmar. I'm an agriculture engineer. I have just a comment about your last one, about we need to be aware what is our footprint. I guess we need tools to know what we are doing and how. We need the information in order to take the decisions. And simple tools, and this is what we need to provide to the people. Otherwise, people is not going to be aware about that. So I think we need to develop apps or information flow that people, okay, when I buy this product, this is my footprint. What should I do about that? The other question, I skipped this one. Thank you.
I agree with you, but on the other hand, there are many things that people already know and they're still not doing it. So it's even more tricky than that, I'd say. To what I work a lot with in my company is to say to people that they are on the way to something new and they need to change day by day. So have a challenge all the time to change something that you can feel that you can change. So not going into saying you should stop doing this. For example, one of my colleagues in Helsingborg, she said she was very annoyed that she was taking the car every day. And then I said, well, think about something else that you can do instead. And then she called me up and said, well, I've made a promise that I shouldn't buy anything in a year, any clothes or anything any new in a year. And then she called me up some days later and said, now I have five of my other colleagues doing the same thing. And then I think it's much better that she goes buy her car every day and do those kind of things that really triggered her, and she made a fun thing of it and got more people on board. So I think we need to think more of where are you as a person now and what can you do as the next step to take your further towards that sustainable development society that we're all aiming for.
I do agree. We need tools for that, and I think there's an app for that, actually. There are several apps. I know that Viskogen is working on ways to highlight for private individuals also how the carbon footprint is and how it reflects on your behaviors and how you can offset it. We do the same for companies. I also know friends in the industry, other organizations who have excellent apps for example, food. I'm not sure if the Swedish meat producers would be super happy about that one, but there are apps definitely for how to look at food consumption and so on. So there is more to be done, definitely. But as a consumer, you need to be able to do really easy choices.
Yes, this is about because we don't want to leave the comfort zone.
It's true. Yeah, leaving the comfort zone is really difficult. It is about making those small decisions every day and also the big ones.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ngolia. I'm from the Salvation Army. I think I'm very happy to hear about that agriculture is part of the COP because that's been a big debate and actually one of the big problems is the low price of carbon. And I think Linda, you mentioned, you lock these farmers to enter into this. I think they are beneficial, but the cost of monitoring is so high. Do you see any scope for increasing the price of carbon in the coming years?
I'm really happy because I think you answer that question. I think we're charging too little. If if the flights are not going down fast enough, then the price is too low. So I mean, of course, there's a difference between the voluntary market and others, but yeah, definitely.
Maybe I should just add that one thing our study from Cambodia showed that the real costs of defending forests against, for example, rubber plantations, that's between $30 and $50 per ton CO2, a lot higher than the prices offered right now at the carbon market, but actually very close to the real cost of damage of 1 ton of CO2, which I think in the last large study from the US was estimated to be about $36 per ton. So for a beginning, I think the cost should reflect that cost of damages. That would be a start, at least.
Yeah, I just want to like for the when people should make a decision. I think that of course we can have like a carbon figure, but there are so much more things. For example, with meat, then we have all the biological biologisk mångfald and things like that. So there are like things that even though you're lowering your carbon footprint, there is something else to think of, and that is also something that we need to keep in mind. And the eco-labeling are of course looking into that, but still it's tricky, I think. So it's not easy. I think that the understanding of the complexity in the question in these issues, and that we are moving forward and not doing something good and not something bad, needs to be more that people understand that. So if I'm into this now, they say you should go and buy an environmental car, and there's no such thing as an environmental car, right? And then the next day, this environmental car can't go on some street of Stockholm because it happened to be a diesel car that was an environmental car yesterday. And then every people in the society, they don't trust the eco labels. They don't trust when we say that something is environmentally good and bad. We need to talk on these issues in a different way. We need to talk about them as this journey that we're in, and this is a better step than it was yesterday, because this was really undermining. I mean, my father, he's really angry now because he bought this environmental car, and he says to me, "What's environmental car yesterday and it's not today?" And that is what, then he doesn't want to go and buy a Svan-marked something the next day, and this is really, really a problem, I think.
Thank you. I think there was a question over there. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Anne-Sophie. I work at the Africa department at SIDA. I was wondering, are you aware of any studies sort of comparing the increase in productivity and adaptation that you mentioned, using the offsetting, comparing that to other projects which are not using carbon offsetting? Like, could you see the same sort of increase even though you're not using carbon offsetting in the projects? Sort of, is it, my question is really, is it worth, you know, in terms of time and, you know, trainings needed to be able to collect those funding through a carbon offsetting program? So is it worth for the communities to invest in this? Because as you mentioned before, there are a lot of examples where communities have invested a lot of time, as far as I know, and trainings, and still have not received any funding.
Well, I think it's many different questions. So one is the last part about whether or not you receive the funding. As we saw in the RED project, there are farmers or forest conservers who doesn't receive the funding, which is just very, very unprofessional. And you need to have a project set up that ensures that the funding reaches who it intends to do. I haven't seen myself a study comparing the yield increase, for example, between carbon offsetting programs using the same methods and projects using SALM or agroforestry. What we do know is that finding funding for agroforestry and sustainable agricultural land management is quite difficult. CEDA, for example, has an extreme low budget on agroforestry funding today and sustainable agricultural funding. So finding that money is difficult. So the carbon offsetting is the way to finance those kinds of projects. I would love to see more funding, both from the Green Climate Fund on sustainable agriculture, primarily agroforestry, but also from CEDA.
And maybe I can add something there. I think there's been an interesting shift in the public debate lately, and that's maybe also like behavioral psychology has a little bit to do with that. Who cares about the climate? I mean, it's so far away, we can't see the carbon, but we care about our health. And lately, with all these discussions we've seen in cities like London and Paris, where basically studies have shown that people's life has been affected. I mean, people die earlier because they live in polluted cities, too much traffic, too many pollutants, and so on and so forth. Or people who are living in using these wooden open fires in Kenya, cooking there, also basically suffer tremendously in their health. I mean, these arguments seem to be flying much easier with funders, but also with changing behavior. So leaving aside the carbon a little bit and actually talking about, again, like indirectly, the climate benefits that we achieve on the sideline, but actually the health benefits, I think this is a really convincing argument. And we've seen that, I mean, in Hamburg, they started to implement bans, Stockholm maybe as well. So cities are actually like now getting more and more support to doing that. Because of health issues. And just the recent report in Malmö also pointed to that Malmö actually also, if you live in Malmö, your life expectancy decreases a little bit because the air is polluted. So we have to do something about it. So it's not the carbon anymore, it's the health. But the carbon is a side benefit. And I think that's an interesting discussion here, because then what does it matter whether we know the true cost of carbon? What really matters then is that if we do climate-friendly activities or policies, we actually have a health benefit for people. That seems to be a convincing argument, I guess.
I fully agree, but I don't think that they always go hand in hand. Like, for example, when you buy things, that doesn't really, you don't see that on your health.
Well, if you eat less meat, then
if you eat, it can, absolutely, it can, but it doesn't always go hand in hand. But when it does, of course, we should use that as a tool to communicate.
Yeah, maybe just to add, I think it's right that this behavior as a human, you can easier take small steps, and if you can see a direct benefit to your own personal self, fine, I'll go for that. But on the other hand, I think the issues of global warming are so serious, so it's also important that our policymakers maintain that focus on greenhouse gas emissions, and that we have to reach, like you say, the negative emissions. It's not going to come on its own from people's hobbies of not shopping or being a vegetarian. We also have to have the international focus and negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just thinking about this with the train and the airplane again. That this is why it doesn't happen. I mean, it's not possible to go from one place to another. We should go to Kiruna with my department, and then it happened to be a work on the train track that evening, so we couldn't go by train, and the flight took 1 hour, and the train took many hours. So then we had to change direction and go to Tällberg instead, and took the train with our department. But it's not, another department wouldn't do that in my company. They would take the flight if nothing else works. They wouldn't change where they were going, but we did. But it's like there need to be like systems supporting the change that we're doing, and there are not in place when it comes to the flights. We don't have system enough. I mean, it's much easier to book a flight. You can go into what app you want and book a flight in 10 minutes. And how do you book? I want to go to Italy this summer. And I said, we should go by train. And now, how do we book? How do we do? I don't really know. So now we're searching about how do we book this train ticket. So there are too many hinder in the way. Yeah, yeah, I know. I'm part of that, but I don't have the time. I mean, I just want to book it as easy as I book the flight. I don't have the time to read everything in that Facebook group, even though it's a good Facebook group.
There's one more question over there, please.
So, what does the numbers look like in terms of carbon offsetting? Like, has it increased in terms of the money available, or do we see an increase or a decrease in the money available? I mean, for me, I just have a feeling that it has decreased. I don't know if because we talk less about this as an option nowadays, but I have no idea. So perhaps you know globally what it looks like.
I can't say globally on in terms of funding from corporates or private individuals, but what we see as Viskogen is that there is an increased interest from investment funds and investors in terms of carbon offsetting. And if it wouldn't have been for the long journey of starting off with the Kenya Agricultural Carbon Project, doing all those lessons learned, we wouldn't have Livelihoods Fund, the French investment fund, as an investor today. And having those, I mean, the Livelihoods Fund consists of a number of European companies who are investing in this fund together to see both the economic, environmental and social benefits. And them investing 3.5 million euros upfront, I don't think it would have happened some years back.
I mean, to the money, I think it's a straightforward question. I think it's very hard to find answers to that because it depends on what market you're looking at. The CDM is still running very strongly, and it's been growing, I mean, since, I don't know, the late 90s, I guess. There's a lot of money in that because companies or countries have to. And then there's a voluntary carbon market that's kind of like staggering, like more back and forth. I mean, it's not really that much in comparison to the CDM. But it's true that the price of carbon has decreased and it's much lower than what it should be. But that's because there's an oversupply of carbon credits and it's based on, past calculations and, I mean, lots of flaws in the system, I guess. Yes.
I mean, I think there is some hope in the new ETS, but that will add that the carbon prices might go up within this new system. But I have no idea on that.
I can just comment with my slide that I had that many companies in this association then said that they were going to offset more in the future. So that might be something that's not scientifically proved or anything, but it might say something.
Are there any more questions? Or any comments, final thoughts, something positive?
Yes, I have one comment. I wonder, because you're all interested in carbon offsetting and so on, whether you see the change in status among, for example, traveling by plane compared to traveling by public transport by other means, and whether you think that this is actually something that would trigger a major change, because I think we are in a social media era where our branding of ourselves is extremely important. So whether you experience from your perspectives, whether there's a major kind of change potential there.
From my point of view, there is many people around me that is really pressuring each other not to fly. On the other hand, I don't think that is so wide. That's not the feeling that I got when I go to my company and talk to other people. They are not really there. So there are a few people that are really there, but it's not a big group yet, I think. But that's just a personal reflection. But I think that from me, I think a lot if I fly somewhere. It's really hard. I haven't made my own decision never to fly, but it's really hard for me to do it. It's hard for me to make that decision, and it wasn't before. Then I thought, well, I do other things, like you say, but now I feel like no, I shouldn't do this. So something is really happening, I think.
I'm not really sure. I haven't seen the statistics on it. I'm really hoping, personally, that it is kicking off and that we will see a huge increase in trains. I think the Swedish train situation this weekend had a bit of a down on that one. But in general, I'm really hoping for it. And I'm hoping that it will be not a social media phenomenon just to increase your brand, but to go wider than that and go beyond the big cities. Then maybe, yeah.
Well, I just read an article today about this, and there was, I don't remember where she was from. It was a researcher who had done some studies on this, and she said that the only things that really worked were higher prices and restrictions on commercials for travel. That was the two things that worked.
Yeah.
No, but going back a bit on the funding for carbon offsetting and the funding for carbon sequestration products as such, I think one of the challenges that we discussed just before was this separation of the funding to forestry in, for example, RED and for agriculture. And there, agroforestry really falls in between. And we see a huge problem with that. We keep debating whether or not agroforestry belongs to forestry or it belongs to agriculture. And from an outside perspective, it might just seem, oh, it just works. It doesn't matter where it lands. Well, it does, because if the forestry sector doesn't embrace agroforestry as its thing, then there won't be any funding in the NDCs for it, or in the strategies, in the NAMAs and APAs. And if the agricultural sector does the same and doesn't embrace agroforestry, it doesn't go within their budget line either. So somehow we need to find a way to really integrate the forestry and agricultural perspective and really let agroforestry fly there a bit, because it has those both levels and it could work on both sections, reduce deforestation and get productivity up while sequestering carbon. So yeah, I would love to see that. I'm not saying it should be one sector, but definitely agroforestry should belong to one of them, definitely, or its own.
Yes, I agree with you. I found that myself in research. I have a comment here from the FAO, from Serena Fortuner, who's joined us live from Rome, I suppose. She says, thank you very much for the interesting presentations. She has a question, or more than a question actually, it's a comment or a contribution with regards to RED Plus and the involvement of stakeholders. She says that yes, RED Plus has been negotiated for a long time, the last more than a decade, at various meetings. The RED Plus readiness process has been taking more time than probably many people anticipated, and has to do with the technicalities of it and the measurement and monitoring, what we heard also from Ida, the governance, tenure, and so on. But at least it also meant that actually we talk about forests again at the policy arena. So there is actually a renewed discussion about forests. And the good news is that now implementation is speeding up, and the Green Climate Fund, I think, is also actually investing a lot in forestry, in Ecuador at least they are. And it looks like there are more important actions that are happening and start happening on the ground at the national, subnational, and local level. Some countries are standing out, like Colombia, Ecuador, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And if anyone has more questions, she's happy to share more information in the future. Warm regards from the FAO from Rome. And if there's no further questions or comments from the audience, then I just want to end on a happy note. I read on the morning, I took a train at 4 this morning, and actually this train was on time. Yes, from Malmö. And I read an article that was just recently released, I think, in one of the Nature journals. And they did a study on, so I have to remember, it was very early and I was tired. But basically what they said is that no matter what the policy makers are going to decide in the future, now it looks like that businesses are taking the lead and actually have already started to invest so much money in renewable energies and non-carbon intensive technologies that it looks like that no matter how, if the United States are in or out or whatever happens, that there will be a huge shift of money going from dirty technologies and dirty industries into clean industries and clean technologies that are less carbon intensive. So there's going to be a huge share of stranded assets, as you would say in business jargon, basically where investors that are still keeping on investing in carbon intensive like coal or oil or tar sands will actually losing a lot of money because the tide has turned and the future is looking a bit brighter. Of course, there's still lots of work to do, and I think carbon offsetting, as we heard, has a role to play, if not even just to get the financing to actually do the more important things, which are adaptation and poverty reduction. We have, of course, maybe to work on business strategies and policies to reduce flying, invest in train systems, open technologies to actually make it easier for people to travel by train in Europe, which I agree is very difficult. Me going to Germany, I have a hard time to finding good trains, and it's more expensive than flying, unfortunately. And to the negotiations as well that have to continue and have to basically pave the way to make more bold, I would say, like more bold targets for countries. But ultimately, we all here also have a role to play. I mean, responsibility to basically make informed choices when it comes to consuming and thinking about where materials come from in the end. So I'd like to thank the speakers of this afternoon very much. We can give them a hand. And I do have a little gift for you from Maria, from the GMV, from Focali. It's a card game of the sustainability goals.
For the train journeys.
So you can, exactly, on long train journeys. And I would like to thank you for having been here today on this afternoon. So thank you very much for coming here, for asking questions and for joining us. And we hope to see you sometime soon in the future, either here or in Gothenburg, or maybe also in Lund or Malmö. So enjoy the National Day tomorrow. Have a nice afternoon. Thank you.